Hello, everybody. Hopefully, I've got a couple of people who are watching who can let me know that I am live. I'm going to be having a quick look at the comments and messages in a moment, but I just wanted to say welcome and thank you very much for tuning in. It's going to be a very short session that I'll be doing this evening for the 11 plus journey. And the reason for this is just I have done a much longer version of this slightly earlier in the year. What I'll do is I'll put a link in the comments. I work with students tackling interviews, and because some of the interviews were a little bit earlier this year, I did a group video a little earlier on. So I'll pop that into the link so that if you are here and you're wanting something more from interview questions, then you can go back to my previous video. But tonight I will be tackling unusual interview questions. So hopefully you're here for that. And I'll be starting in probably about a moment. I think I can see that people can see and hear me. So just before I begin, a little bit about myself. I'm an admin in the 11 Plus Journey group. I've been here a little while now. I run a tuition company myself called the Education Hotel, and I'm here really to help out with interview techniques. I also do the wow words that you see each week in the group. So that's a little bit about me, but really what we're focusing on this evening is unusual interview questions. So I know that at this time we start to see schools doing interviews, assessment days, and sometimes there's a little bit of a fear of the unknown. And today I'll be talking about how we can tackle that both beforehand and how we can tackle that in an interview session as well. So what I mean when I say fear of the unknown is if you get an invite and your child is going to an assessment day, they won't necessarily tell you what's happening throughout the day. They might say there's going to be a sample lesson or there's going to be some group activities. And that in itself can bring a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of unknown for a student, because we're quite used to, especially having taken entrance exams, we're quite used to having everything set out. You know, I know what my English exam is going to look like. I know what the math exam is going to look like. If I don't know what the questions inside are going to be, I know how long it's going to last. I know what the setup is. Suddenly an assessment day can seem overwhelming. There's a whole load of students there. None of them you know, maybe a couple of them you will. And you might be doing things, your child will be doing things that they've not done before. So maybe that's a trial science lesson, or maybe they'll be doing something in drama, or maybe there'll be a debate. And often it can be quite hard to predict what these big assessment days will be like. But one thing that I like to do with my students, and it's a pre-thing, so it's before going into the interviews, is we like to familiarize. And the way that I explain this to my students is it's all about getting the mind ready for what's going to happen. So if you imagine you've taken lots of practice tests, or you've worked at home on practice questions, or you've tried a mock exam, you know what it's going to be like. You've got that feel. But how can we get your brain ready and get your brain used to the idea of an assessment day? Well, one of the ways that we like to do it is by watching YouTube videos and having a look at what the school looks like. And if they've done any familiarization videos, any open day videos, now is the time to start looking at those. It allows your child to be able to get familiar with their surroundings so that when they're walking into this assessment day, they don't also have the idea of a completely new surrounding. They can say, oh, I saw that was on the video. And they're more used to the idea of what that school will be like, and pause the video and talk about it. So maybe it shows you all the way around the school, and one of the things that it shows you is the lunch hall cafeteria. You might want to pause and say, okay, well, this is possibly where you could be when you're on your assessment day, and if there's a lunch involved, that might be one of the places that you'll be. And what you're doing is you're just getting your child used to the idea of this new place. So if you imagine, if you and I are going to a job interview, then you have to consider, am I going to get there? What's the place going to be like? How am I going to find the right room? And all of those questions can be, all of those kind of worries can be lowered a little bit if we know what it might look like beforehand. So that's one of the tips that I would say if you are thinking about these big assessment days or interview days. The second thing that we do, and this is again about getting used to interviews and getting used to the idea, is one of the things that we look at is visualization. So by visualizing what might happen, and I stress might because it might not be exactly the same. Again, we're getting our brain used to the idea. So if your child is particularly nervous and they're really worried, and this might be one of the reasons that you're watching this video of mine now, and you're thinking, oh, they're really nervous about tackling these unusual interview questions, then start to work with them on visualizing what that day might look like, or that interview session might look like. So get them to sit down and have a think. And I find it easier if I close my eyes, cover my eyes, and think. And I imagine going into the school, what's it going to look like? And I will chat away with my students and say, well, one parent will drop you off, dependent on if they're going to drop you off in the car, they're going to get the bus, what's going to happen. And when they leave you at the door, there might be somebody there to meet you. And I ask them to think about what that person might look like. And I ask them to imagine what could happen. So I say, okay, well, we're walking towards a classroom. And the first thing that you're going to do, you're meeting all of the people who are going to be on the same assessment day. And you've walked in and you don't know any of them. I want you to have a think about what that's like. And I'll ask them questions, how do you feel about it? What do you think you could do? If you are in a situation where you know absolutely nobody, what are you going to do? And I ask them to think through, okay, I'm going to go up to somebody and I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to say who I am, and I'm going to ask them, what their name is and where they're from. And just by having that visualization and going through different scenarios, so maybe they go into a language lesson, maybe they go into a French lesson. I do it little by little, so 5-10 minutes. I tell them it's about getting their brain used to the idea. And the idea behind this is that if you go into an assessment day or an interview, hopefully by the time you've gone through all of this visualization, you've had that forward thinking, you will be in the position where if you are put in an unusual situation, so just like an unusual interview question, you would have been there in your mind. So maybe one of those visualization scenarios, you get lost. What are you going to do if you get lost? Are you going to make your way back to where you were before? Are you going to go in a classroom and ask for help? That way, if you do get lost in the real thing, it's not going to throw you because your brain's already been there. So that would be the second thing I'd recommend doing beforehand. Now, the third thing is more to do with questions and this tackling unusual interview questions. And that's being honest with your child and saying to them, look, there will be questions that you haven't prepared for. Sometimes when I get students for mock interviews, and I've been doing a lot of them this week, I will have a student who it's fairly obvious they've prepared a lot, and they've got some really confident answers, and they've got some nicely well thought out answers. And then I'll put a question in there that they've not heard of before. And usually I get this kind of face. And that's because everything else has been prepared, and yet this one is the unusual one. So do make sure that your child knows there may well be questions that they don't know, they haven't prepared, and that is fine. That's part of what an interview is. So whilst you might do some discussions, you might try a mock interview if your child is particularly nervous. You might do some practice around interviews, that discussion, practice. Again, if you see my previous videos, I'd never recommend scripting. I'd always recommend discussion. But there will be some things maybe that you haven't discussed that will come up in the interview. And so do make sure your child is aware of that. Because sometimes they can get in there and think it's going to be exactly the same as that practice that they've done, or it might be really similar to the stuff they've discussed with mum and dad. And whilst there may be a lot of it that will be similar, there might be something that's a little bit more unusual and that really challenges them. And being aware is being forewarned is being forearmed. So make sure that they are aware that that is going to happen and that it's not an unusual thing. So they're not trying to catch you out. It's just that maybe they would like to know this very specific question. We don't know what it is, and that's fine. So whilst we're doing this preparation, do make sure that your child is aware that there might be some unusual questions that come up. The second and part of what I'm going to discuss this evening is really how to tackle those unusual questions. So what can your child do to avoid that panic, deer in headlights, oh my God moment when they are asked something that is an unusual question? And part of it comes from how you tackle normal interview questions. Today, I am speaking to you, and hopefully I am something I have to work at, keeping the speed of my voice at a normal speed. But the first time a child practices an interview, or the first time that a child goes into an interview, they can speak very fast. And that is really mostly noticeable when they tackle unusual questions, because either you get the freeze moment, which is a very, very long pause, and then you might have to help out as an interviewer, or you get a massive rush. And it's about talking to your child about those extremes. So I wouldn't want to hear an answer that just looks like this, which is very quick, very hard to understand, and often happens when we're nervous. But likewise, if somebody asked a question, you wouldn't want just a silence where they just stare at you. So making sure that your child has something that they know that they can say that is able to communicate with the interviewer that it's a question that they've not come across before. So I would always say to students something like, oh, that's interesting, or that's unusual. I've not thought about that before. Can I have a moment to think about it? Or having something, a way that you have discussed when you get an unusual question, to say, oh, that's something I've not considered. I'm just going to take a pause. And that allows an interviewer to be able to go, okay, I know what they're doing. They've not just not heard my question or not understood my question. They are actually taking that moment to think about it. Now, do make sure that your child is aware that if they don't understand the question, it's perfectly fine to clarify. So if an interviewer has used an unusual term, or they've spoken a little bit quickly, or maybe they've coughed in the middle of a sentence and you haven't quite heard it, absolutely fine to ask them to repeat. Absolutely fine to ask for clarification, because those things are what we do in a normal conversation. And an interview really is a conversation. So first thing is clarifying. Second thing is letting them know if you need to have a moment to think about it. It avoids just the freeze. So it allows you to say something back to the interviewer, so the interviewer knows that you've understood the question, but that you're going to take a moment and you're just going to consider it for a moment. The second is the kind of the ums, the ahs, and all of that. And that tends to happen when somebody rushes into an answer and they haven't quite considered the end of it. And we do this all the time in conversation. We will start a story and then have to have our brains catch up. So often I do it when I'm at a big kind of social gathering. There's loads of conversations happening around me. Sometimes I find it quite hard to focus. And that means that I will start telling a story and then I'll just blank on it. And there's a lot of ums and ahs. And ultimately it's because I haven't really thought about what I'm going to say. I've just launched straight into it. And so part of that is making sure you've got the time to pause. Ums and ahs, they're not really a big issue unless there's lots and lots of them. We use ums and ahs in our everyday vernacular, everyday sentences, but it gets very noticeable when it's a very long story and there's a lot of them. So take that moment, have a think. And those of you who've watched me and in the previous video that I've done, I think I've previously talked about the STAR technique for the for the tell me an example of. So tell me an example of a time that you have worked in a team. If you don't take that moment to stop, have a think about, well, when was I in a team? What happened? What did we do? Then you can start that conversation and have no idea where the rest of it's going. So tell me an example of when you've been in a team. Right, well, when I was in year 6, earlier this year, we were in a team and it was history, and that's your brain catching up. Whereas if you'd just taken that moment to stop, to have a think, and then to tell your story, and even to say to them, can I have a moment to think about that? And have a think. And make sure that it is planned out in your head. Not every word. We just need to know what happened in that story. Make sure it's all in the right order. And then we don't end up with the ums and the ahs and the, oh, actually this happened. And the, I'm just going to tell you a side story at the same time. So make sure that your thoughts are in order. And one way to help your child to do that is just to make sure that they pause. So if they pause before they answer a question, it allows our brain to be able to process it. And that tends to reduce the ums and the ahs. But I wouldn't get too worried about it as a parent, because ums and ahs are in normal conversation. The second thing that you can do to kind of help your child, if they're asked an interview question they've not prepared for, is to encourage them beforehand to think about all the things that they've done. And this sounds a little bit unusual, kind of asking you to go through the history. Shouldn't a child know everything that they've done? But a lot of them forget. And especially after months, maybe sometimes a year or so of practicing questions and doing 11 plus, and maybe they've done a grammar school and they've done another entrance exam, maybe they're doing an independent as well. Often a lot of those examples of things that you have done, or indeed kind of what would your friends say in 3 words, all of that, hobbies, interests, that can often get lost. And that can get lost because you've done the preparation and they're so focused on the last 2 months. And maybe because of COVID, something that they wanted to do that was a club didn't quite happen. Maybe they wanted to join the football team, but by the time they were going to join, it was COVID, and so they haven't managed to do that. Now, when somebody asks about, do you play in any clubs? They might have forgotten that, but they might not remember, and then they'll freeze, and then we'll end up with the ums and the ahs. If you've had that conversation with them, then they can say, well, I'm not a member of any sports clubs at the moment, but before COVID, I really wanted to join a football club. And I wanted to do this because I really like playing with other people, and I wanted somewhere that I could improve my skills. And that allows them to be able to have that answer. So remind your child of all the things that they have done. And the kind of additional part is have those interesting conversations. So some of the ones that students tend to get a little bit stuck on, that I can see, is those if questions, are what I call them. So if you could go back to any time in history, when would it be? Or if you could be a superhero for a day. I don't have a right or wrong answer. It's just that we haven't considered them. And partly that's quite fun to consider. And some children will be absolutely fine tackling those questions in a pressured environment. Others will do better, and you know your child the best. So others will do better to having had a think about them, sometimes beforehand, or discussion. So discursive preparation is useful for those unusual questions, and ultimately picking out some of the more unusual things that you've heard get asked. Obviously, one of the things that the 11 plus journey does quite well is parents share experiences. So do take a look through the group, people who have shared what happens, but also I can put down some questions in the comments, which I would consider unusual questions, but they're mostly kind of if this was to happen, what would you do? The other thing that I have to say is I know that Kid Coach app, which is run by Coven, also has some really great questions on that. So do take a look at that as well. But ultimately, you're looking at things like if you found £10 in the road, what you would do. If you were given £100 and you had to give it to a charity, what would you do? If you were Prime Minister for the day, what would you do? So those types of ones are the ones that sometimes people consider unusual because they're not our typical, tell me about your school, tell me about your favorite subject, what do you read, what's the news, those types of questions. There's no wrong answer. It's always about pause, have a think. It might not be that you have the perfect answer. And this is one of the things I say to my students. You don't have to have the perfect answer, but it's nice to have an answer. So even if you answer, what time could you go back in history? If you could go back to any time in history, when would you go back to? And you say, well, I would like to go back to when the dinosaurs were on the earth because I really love dinosaurs. And the interviewer starts asking about your favorite dinosaur, and you start talking about velociraptors with them. And then you think, oh, actually, I would have liked to have gone back to the Victorian period. There's no right answer. So that's absolutely fine that you said dinosaurs because that's what you were thinking at that time. So absolutely you can have a conversation about dinosaurs. If it is something where you blurted out an answer, that's why you want to stop. Stop, have a think, and then say an answer. An answer is better than no answer. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of a taster about tackling unusual interview questions, both what to do before going into an interview and how to prepare your child to think about their interview process and to really consider what it might be like so that they are used to it, and what they might do in an interview if they were tackled with an unusual question. And it is worth saying that as an interviewer, some of the most interesting answers that I really love getting are those unusual ones. So an interviewer isn't asking them to catch somebody out. They really are asking them because they're quite interesting to know the answer to. I love hearing people's reasons why they would have a specific superpower. It gives me a little bit of an insight into a child's brain. And also, it's the non-prepared ones. It's the ones that they haven't thought about so much. And that allows me to really be able to see, what are they like as a person as opposed to kind of pre-prepared. So they're not asking it to catch you out. They are really asking because they want to know what's going to happen. Thank you ever so much for listening. If you're watching it on replay, do give me a hashtag replay so that I know that you've seen this. If you've got any questions, pop them down in the comments. And again, as I said, I'll come back and I'll drop links in as and when. I want to say thank you to Saba, who consistently lets me come onto the 11 Plus journey and talk about what we are doing. And if you need any more interview advice, the Education Hotel, which is my company, is running a interview workshop. It's on the 18th of December. It's me that's going to be running it, so do feel free to reach out if you've got any of those questions. But we're kind of done for this short session on tackling unusual interview questions. So thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.